In this segment, we're going to focus on the Supreme Court. And so far, we focused this hour on the House impeachment inquiry, obviously, and cases related to impeachment may well make their way up to our highest court. If they do, they would join a packed docket of cases that could be seismic to millions of Americans and the country overall. The court's new term, which begins this Monday, is loaded with hot-button issues, all of which could impact the 2020 elections, from gun laws to abortion to major immigration cases. And it all kicks off with a pair of highly watched cases on gay rights. For more on the session to come and how the court might handle them, let's turn to one of the foremost experts in the Supreme Court, NPR's legal affairs correspondent, Nina Totenberg. Nina, thank you very much for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I want to get to the docket in a second, but more a process question as it relates to what's going on right now on the Hill regarding the impeachment and inquiry. Hypothetically, if the House inevitably votes to impeach the president, and they know, as the audience I think knows, a simple majority, it would then go to the Senate. And while everyone is focused on the 67 votes that would be necessary to impeach a president, in effect it's a trial. And the judge will be none other than the Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts. To that end, do we know the role of the judge in that? Does he decide not just balls and strikes, but admissibility of evidence? What would be the role that Roberts would assume if, in fact, this gets to the Senate?
Well, we can only look to the last one of these we saw, which was Chief Justice Rehnquist during the Clinton impeachment. And I anchored those trial proceedings as they were. And I think that Rehnquist barely said more than a few words. Now, we can't assume that it'll be the same now, because there was at least some bipartisan consensus about how to go forward in the proceedings then, and I'm not 100% sure that will be the case here. Moreover, if you cast your mind back to the Nixon impeachment, the Supreme Court at the last minute got this case involving the Nixon tapes. It had come to the court in, I don't remember whether it was late June or early July. The court within 2 weeks ruled that the president had to turn over those tapes to the special prosecutor in the case investigating the Watergate affair. And in turn, the special prosecutor, with the consent of both parties, turned them over to the House Impeachment Committee, the Judiciary Committee that was looking into impeachment. And once the transcripts and the actual tapes were revealed, that provided the so-called smoking gun, and that led to near certain impeachment, many Republicans finally breaking ranks and voting to impeach.
Let's turn to the upcoming docket. And Tuesday, the Supreme Court's going to hear 3 major gay rights cases. 2 of them, they're from gay men who say that they were fired solely for being gay. The third from a transgender woman who was fired for being trans as she began her transition. At issue, whether the 1964 Civil Rights Act protections against sex discrimination apply to the LGBTQ community. Talk about what at the end could reshape how we look at gay rights in this country.
Well, you know, on one side are the employers who, in these cases, who say Congress never intended to be covering gay or trans employees, and that's the end of the story right there. If you want to change the law, you go to Congress. And on the other side are gay and trans employees who say, listen, there are lots of things that Congress didn't contemplate and ended up under the language of the law being the law. For example, you couldn't find a dictionary in 1964 that would have even defined the term sexual harassment, and the Supreme Court has said sexual harassment is covered by the ban on sex discrimination. And it said it's even covered for same-sex sexual harassment. And that decision was written by the late Justice Scalia, who wrote that it really isn't the purpose of the legislators that we care about. It's what the law says and actually says on paper, and how we've applied it over the years. So it's a close question. It's a very conservative court now. My guess will be that the employers in these cases will win, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on it.
Abortion also potentially could have some important rulings here. 3 cases. The first, a growing requirement from states that abortion doctors have admitting privileges to nearby hospitals. That would greatly reduce the number of doctors in clinics. In some cases where they're very limited to begin with, other state requirements for abortions are going to be heard, including patients are shown ultrasounds and photos of fetuses or given detailed descriptions of the procedure as it's happening, and a case establishing bubble zones outside of clinics where pro-life counselors can try and dissuade women from having abortions, all seemingly further cutting away from choice rights.
The Louisiana case involving admitting privileges for doctors, it's the exact duplicate of a statute enacted in Texas and struck down by the Supreme Court just 3 years ago. But of course, Justice Kennedy was on the court then, and he's gone now, replaced by Justice Kavanaugh, who is viewed as considerably more receptive to regulation and perhaps even ultimately the reversal of Roe. So the court has blocked that lower court opinion from going into effect. The lower court had said that the state law was okay, but as I said, it seemed to be in exact defiance almost of what the Supreme Court had held 3 years ago. Now, if the court flips on that very same question, that will be a tea leaf for us all to see in very stark terms about where it's headed on abortion. I think most people think that ultimately it will either outright overturn Roe or do so for all practical purposes, but whether it takes 1, 5, or 10 years, nobody knows.
Finally, I want to ask you about immigration. November, the court will hear arguments on DACA, of course, at the Obama policy that provides protections for undocumented minors being brought into the country. The current administration has been working to end those protections. The court will also hear arguments about cross-border shootings by U.S. military and other cases related to border asylum and immigration-related issues should also potentially be heard as well. Do you think we're going to have finally clarity on DACA?
I think probably we will have some clarity on DACA. The question in the case is sort of, I think for most lay people, kind of bizarre, because the question is, nobody doubts that President Trump could roll back DACA if he just were to say, I don't want to have the same policy as that President Obama had, and I'm getting rid of the program. But that's not actually what he said. What he said was that the Obama program, the Dreamers program, was illegal. And if the court says that it was legal, it was a perfectly legal program, then the president could conceivably be stuck, either have to take responsibility for getting rid of the Dreamers program, which he clearly is ambivalent about doing, or just let it go ahead. I think that the odds still are, this is a court that's very deferential to presidential power, and there are ways they can get around some of the questions here, so I wouldn't be surprised if the court sides with the Trump administration, which thinks that if they win, they'll get a deal out of the Democrats. Of that, I'm not so sure.
And I would agree on that as well. Nina, I appreciate the time. Thank you so much today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone, when we come back from the high court to some high drama at the border, we've got details on the lens the president is actually talking about to keep migrants out of the states. And if you haven't heard this, you will not believe what you're about to hear.